For more than 2 decades, a serial killer was stalking the streets of Los Angeles, leaving behind this trail of terror. And because he seemed to stop for a long time, he earned a really chilling nickname, the Grim Sleeper. So, in this explainer, we're going to break down the story of how in the world he was able to hide in plain sight for so long.
And that right there is the central question, isn't it? Because this isn't just the story of some monster. No, it's about the circumstances, the system that allowed him to get away with it, to operate with total impunity for years and years. It's a cautionary tale, and one we really need to understand.
But before we go any further, it's so important that we remember who is at the absolute heart of this story: the victims. For years, the cases of the women you see here went completely unsolved. Their community cried for help, and those cries just went unheard. This explainer is as much about them as it is about their killer.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, back in the mid-1980s. A predator was targeting a very specific part of Los Angeles, and a very specific kind of victim. And at first, he wasn't known as the Grim Sleeper. He had another name, the South Side Slayer. Now, the profile of the victims is just tragic, and honestly, it explains why there wasn't a huge public outcry at first. The killer exclusively went after Black women in South Los Angeles. Many of them were struggling with drug addiction or were involved in sex work. And because they lived on the margins of society, their disappearances didn't set off a citywide panic. In fact, the perception of these victims was so poor that the killings were informally called the Strawberry Murders. That derogatory slang term, it tells you everything you need to know about how devalued these women were in the eyes of so many, and that directly affected how urgently the investigation was treated. And this, right here, shows you the disparity perfectly. At the exact same time the Southside Slayer was active, so was Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker. But Ramirez was targeting wealthier, whiter neighborhoods, and that sparked this massive media frenzy and an enormous police response. The Southside Slayer case? It got just a fraction of the attention. Community activists actually had to protest just to get the police to form a task force. So by the end of 1987, the official investigation had pretty much hit a brick wall. The task force was already being downsized because there just weren't enough results or clues. I mean, this quote from the commander himself tells you just how cold that trail had gone. And then, the killings just seemed to stop. And this brings us to the most bizarre, most perplexing part of this entire case. It's the part that would end up giving this killer his famous name. It was just a long, unnerving silence. 14 years. Think about that. That's how long the killer was apparently dormant. And it was this long break that led the press to call him the Grim Sleeper. For over a decade, Los Angeles just thought the terror was finally over. Let's look at this timeline because it really lays it all out. The killing starts in '84, and it's pretty frequent all the way through 1988. And then, boom, this giant 14-year gap. Nothing. Until 2002, when he comes back and claims at least 3 more victims. And this just raises that huge question. Did he actually stop killing, or were there other victims during that time that we just don't know about?
So in the early 2000s, the nightmare just starts all over again. The city slowly begins to realize that the killer from the 80s, he was back, and the hunt was on all over again.
The last murder that we can confirm happened in January of 2007. But get this, it would still take another 3.5 frustrating years before the police would finally make an arrest.
This is him, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the man responsible. He was a former city sanitation worker, a garage attendant. He was a neighbor, living right there in the heart of the very community he was terrorizing.
The big break finally came on July 7th, 2010. They use a new technique called familial DNA, which is basically where they can find relatives of a suspect in DNA databases, and that led them straight to Lonnie Franklin Jr. And just like that, his 25-year reign of terror was finally over.
So, with the killer finally in custody, the long, slow process of getting justice for his many victims could finally begin. When he finally stood in a courtroom, Franklin was charged with the murders of 10 women and the attempted murder of 1 survivor. He was held without bail, of course, awaiting a trial that these victims' families had been waiting decades to see.
So the trial kicked off in 2016. By May, he was found guilty on all counts. A few months later, he was sentenced to death. But here's the thing. Franklin would never actually face execution.
In March of 2020, he was just found dead in his cell on death row. But the story, it gets even darker. Now, he was convicted of 10 murders, but prosecutors brought evidence linking him to at least 4 other victims, which suggests his crimes might have started long before anyone even knew. But even that wasn't the most chilling discovery that was made. When the police searched his home, they found this deeply disturbing collection. Over 180 photographs of different women, and many of them are still unidentified today. And this just leaves us with a final, haunting question. We know about the victims he was convicted of killing, but how many more were there? How many of those faces in those photographs belong to forgotten victims? We may never know the true scope of the Grim Sleeper's crimes.